In the fall of 1896, while every family in Northwood Ridge hurried to chink their cabin roofs in time for the first frost, the 36-year-old widow Eleanor Cade was doing something that left the entire valley stunned and then bursting into mocking laughter. She was building a second roof directly above her already complete cabin roof. No one could understand why a woman living alone would attempt something even the most experienced builders wouldn't dare try. Every time they passed by, the sight remained the same. Eleanor standing on the roof, pulling taut a hemp cord to measure distances, then securing each support post so the second roof frame sat exactly 14 inches above the pine roof below. A complete void, seemingly useless to anyone looking from afar. She even used over 60% more lumber than necessary for a standard cabin roof, a crazy waste in the eyes of mountain folk accustomed to scrimping on every board. Jonas Wickler, the seasoned builder who had erected 48 cabins across 3 counties, stood with hands on hips watching and laughed loudly. "One roof is enough to keep out the rain, Mrs. Cade. 2 roofs will just make the snow crush you faster." Reverend Fulton, the local surveyor regarded as the authoritative voice on mountain construction, watched for a few minutes, then bluntly concluded, "That's the foolishness of loneliness. A widow shouldn't invent techniques no one recognizes." The villagers whispered, "2 roofs mean double the snow, double the weight, double the death." But Eleanor didn't reply to any of it. She continued her work with eerie precision, as if following a blueprint unknown to anyone in Northwood Ridge. The peak of the mockery came at the end of the month, when she nailed the 41st post under the late afternoon light. The autumn wind carried the laughter and head-shaking of the neighborhood. Yet she kept her calm face, standing on the yellowed cabin roof, her eyes fixed on the northern mountains where winter always delivered its harshest blows. At that moment, no one understood why she was doing it, and no one knew that in just a few months, winter would answer for her. Widow Eleanor Cade stood on her finished log cabin roof under the early autumn sun. Measuring each segment of hemp cord stretched between the wooden stakes, she drove into the pine boards at precise 4-foot intervals, exactly the way her husband had once instructed her during the years they spent repairing roofs for logging camps scattered across Wyoming. The cord formed a perfectly even grid, outlining where the entire second roof frame would rise above the first. Her thin but strong hands steadily adjusted each knot. Never trembling, though, the early season wind slipped through the roof, carrying the chill that heralded winter's approach. In the yard below, the sound of Jonas Wickler's axe splitting firewood, the builder, with over 30 years of experience, known as the living timber of Northwood Ridge, suddenly stopped. He set the log down, brushed the sawdust from his beard, and squinted up at the roof as if trying to determine whether he was witnessing the most absurd thing in his life. "Eleanor!" he called loudly. 30 years building mountain cabins, and I've never seen anyone do something this bizarre. Your cabin roof is complete. Boards tight, pitch perfect, drainage good. So what the hell are you building on top of it?" Jonas had built cabins across all 3 Montana counties and survived winters with snow packed heavy as stone. In his eyes, a roof needed to be neat and simple to survive. But Eleanor, always quiet, was even quieter now. She didn't answer right away, only gently pulled the cord until it formed a perfect rectangle, exactly 14 inches higher than the old roof, not off by even a finger's width. "Samuel, my husband, wrote about this in his notebook," she said, her voice low but firm. "He called it a breathing roof. The Swiss in the Alps have built this way for 1,000 years. The still air between the 2 roofs holds heat better than any thick layer of wood." Jonas snorted loudly and turned back to his firewood pile, but his eyes kept stealing glances up at the cabin roof, baffled that a widow could speak of mountain architecture with such confidence. Across the clearing, Surveyor Miles Harrow, the man who oversaw every structure in Northwood Ridge, looked up from his measuring instrument, frowning at the scene. He knew full well that adding a second roof meant adding weight for the wall beams to bear. It meant increasing wind-catching surface area in a region where January gusts could hit 85-90 miles per hour. It meant added complexity, always the enemy of mountain buildings. But instead of intervening, Harrow chose silence, partly out of curiosity, partly because even he could see Eleanor's movements were no amateur work. Some of her measurements were so precise he had to squint and recheck his own professional logic. By the end of September, the widow's strange design had drawn the attention of Reverend Fulton, the man considered the valley's most rational voice, and genuinely concerned for her safety. He came to the site intending to advise her, but when he looked up at the second roof frame taking shape, he had to remove his hat and stand silent for minutes. Before him was an auxiliary structure exactly 14 inches above the main roof, anchored by 41 small but perfectly uniform wooden posts. The outer roof was planned to be shingled with rough-sawn pine boards, overlapped in stepped fashion to create a 42 degrees pitch, a number not everyone knew was the optimal angle for snow to slide off on its own, preventing dangerous buildup. Fulton shook his head at the pile of lumber Eleanor had prepared. Over 1,100 board feet, an unbelievable amount for a woman working alone. "She's putting a hat on her cabin," the old pastor sighed at the evening meeting. "2 roofs when one is enough. That much wood could build half another cabin. I advised her to save it, but she's as stubborn as Samuel. May God rest his soul." But Eleanor paid no attention to the objections or advice. Every morning she climbed the roof as the first sunlight swept the mountain peaks. She measured, adjusted, added each triangular cross brace, every joint tight and perfectly aligned. Everything followed the notes in Samuel's journal, the book she treasured like a relic since the day he died in a mining tunnel collapse. The journal had pages written in old German thermodynamic formulas that would look like meaningless scribbles to anyone else in the valley. But to Eleanor, they were messages from her departed husband. Every night she sat under the oil lamp, opened the journal, and cross-checked each note against her half-finished work. One page stated that the 14-inch air layer between roofs equaled 6 inches of solid wood in heat retention. Another described how wind entering the outer roof lost kinetic energy as it dispersed, unable to penetrate the inner layer. Yet another detailed Alpine structures that had used this principle to survive 60-day continuous blizzards. While the villagers gossiped that she was wasting wood and time, Eleanor was quietly building a system no one understood. An inner roof to retain heat and block water, an outer roof to bear loads and shield wind, and most importantly, a still air chamber, the sealed lung that kept the cabin from losing heat even when outside winds dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, or on deep cold nights reaching -35 degrees Fahrenheit in January. Jonas Wickler began to realize her persistence was no accident. He stood below watching as she used cord to measure roof pitch, then tapped each board into place with a wooden mallet instead of iron to avoid splitting joints. "Not amateur work," he muttered. Surveyor Miles Harrow was impressed by her bracing placed at exact 60 degrees triangles, an optimal force distribution technique few local builders knew. Reverend Fulton no longer saw this as the act of a distraught woman. Instead, he began calling it strange discipline. But their bewilderment wasn't enough to make them accept it. When knowledge is challenged, humanity's first instinct is denial. And so Northwood Ridge kept mocking, kept predicting failure, kept believing winter will teach her a lesson. Eleanor did not. To her, each post, each brace, each inch of air carried a promise to Samuel and to her young daughter Lydia to survive this winter at any cost. On the final night when the second roof was complete, the northeast wind blew hard, carrying October's distinctive cold. Eleanor climbed the roof, stepping on fresh boards still smelling of pine resin, then lit a small oil lamp and placed it on the outermost rafter. The yellow light flickered in the wind, illuminating her sun-weathered but resolute face. Lydia stood in the yard below, clutching her wool shawl, looking up at her mother with eyes mixed with worry and admiration. Eleanor leaned down and said very softly but with fierce determination, "I won't let winter take anyone else from me." The oil lamp glowed in the night like a milestone. No one in Northwood Ridge understood why she did it. But winter was drawing near, and it would be the only judge powerful enough to answer for her. In the first week of November that year, Northwood Ridge faced an unexpected sudden cold snap. As the sun disappeared behind Granite Peak, temperatures plunged to -8 degrees Fahrenheit, thick enough to turn every breath into a dense white plume like stove smoke. Just 2 days later, northern winds from the Alberta Plateau swept into the valley, pushing nighttime lows to -15 degrees Fahrenheit, a chill locals usually only saw in January. Livestock watering troughs froze into thick glass-like layers, and unfinished boards shrank with long, creaking cracks all night. Ordinary single-roof cabins immediately showed their vulnerability to the unseasonably early cold. Ceilings in single-roof homes began to frost over, a thin but sharp layer formed from indoor moisture rising and being defeated by the outer cold. At door cracks, wind sneaked through tiny gaps, blowing across plank floors cold as river stone. Many families had to burn 3 to 4 armloads of firewood daily just to keep their cabins around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, a number that sounded tolerable but still left children shivering. Some smaller cabins couldn't even reach 34 degrees Fahrenheit without constant overnight fires. Meanwhile, Widow Eleanor's cabin operated by an entirely different rule. Anyone stepping inside had to pause for seconds to feel the difference. Warm, stable air, and none of the usual wind whistling sounds from floors or roofs heard in other cabins. Indoor temperatures hovered between 58 and 62 degrees Fahrenheit, and the astonishing part was that she burned exactly 2 armloads of firewood per day. Beneath the pine roof, the cabin's ceiling stayed completely dry, without a trace of frost. Warmth spread evenly from ceiling downward, no cold pouring down from above as people often complained. And the strangest thing was the sound. Whenever strong wind lashed the roof, people could hear the clear impact against the outer layer. But beneath the second roof, there was no vibration at all. The inner roof stood perfectly still, as if belonging to a different world unrelated to the howling wind outside. This finally became too much for Jonas Wickler. One morning, he grabbed his axe and went to Eleanor's to see for himself what that crazy roof was doing. Standing right at the porch, he raised a hand to touch the cabin wall, then pulled it back, unable to understand why it felt so warm while his own cabin stayed freezing despite a roaring fire all night. "Why? Why doesn't the upper roof make your house colder?" he asked, his voice no longer carrying the earlier mockery. Jonas had been certain that an extra roof meant extra heat-losing surface, but the warmth under his palm left him unable to explain what he was feeling. Eleanor only shrugged, offering no further explanation. She didn't want to argue, and she didn't need to. She wanted facts, and she had heard everyone else's words for weeks already. Miles Harrow, who had quietly observed her project since it began, decided to bring his surveying tools to Eleanor's cabin that same afternoon. He hung a thermometer from a rafter, recorded temperatures for 3 straight hours, then moved his anemometer near the door to measure infiltrating wind speed. Comparing it to a standard cabin on the west side of the valley, the results left him speechless. Eleanor's cabin lost heat 41% more slowly, a figure inexplicable by location or wind direction alone. Moreover, wind speed entering the cabin was only 1/7 that of normal homes. That reduction surpassed even cabins chinked with cedar bark or those with dedicated windbreaks. Miles noted everything in his log: ceiling warmth, heat loss rate, firewood consumption. He even double-checked twice, unwilling to believe a widow could create such an optimized system solely from her late husband's old notebook. But though the results were astonishing, the Northwood Ridge community refused to believe. "It's just luck," they said. "Maybe her cabin is sheltered by the pine ridge. Maybe the soil there is thicker and warmer. Just wait. When real winter hits, that crazy roof will collapse." The only explanation they accepted was coincidence. No one wanted to admit that knowledge passed from a dead husband to his widow surpassed the entire valley's understanding. But even as people denied it, nature was preparing its own answer. On the night of November 7, the valley heard a strange sound, the long, low howl of a gray wolf pack echoing through the pine forest. The next morning, many discovered wolf tracks pressed into the thin ice at the forest edge, something that usually appeared only by late December. To the valley's elders, this was a sure sign that extreme cold from the north was forcing animals to move south early. Wolves only descend when hill food runs out, and that only happens in unusually harsh northern winters. All of it made the valley atmosphere grow heavy. Every cabin tightened its doors, stuffed moss into gaps. The Harrow family moved firewood indoors a month early. Jonas built an extra windbreak panel behind his cabin. But while Northwood Ridge prepared in anxiety, the one cabin that maintained steady warmth, Eleanor's, remained silent, as if it belonged to a different climate. No one said it aloud, but the early wolves and the first cold snap were whispering the same forecast. The coming winter would be unlike any before. And now only one question hung in the cold air. Would the second roof they had mocked for 2 months actually work, as she said? In mid-January 1897, Northwood Ridge woke to a morning that survivors later described with one word: silence. Not peaceful silence, but a heavy, suffocating stillness the Sign Mountain folk knew well. Something enormous was preparing to pour down from the north. By noon on the 16th of January 1897, bad news reached the valley from hunters returning from the Timberfall Range. The black wind from the Icelands has swept down into Alberta, and by evening, it arrived the Great Bitterwind Blizzard, the snowstorm recorded in Wyoming history as one of the cruelest ever to scour the region. Winds roared down like a giant blade, 90 to 100 miles per hour, shrieking across roofs like steel scraping stone. Temperatures plunged straight to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. And with wind chill factoring in, it reached minus 63 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to freeze exposed flesh in under 2 minutes. As night fell, Northwood Ridge village became a white frozen blur, where house, sky, and ground were indistinguishable. In the first 60 hours, snow fell so thick it outpaced the drifting wind, 5 feet in 3 days, then piling to 10-11 feet. Single-roof cabins, long accustomed to harsh winters, one by one revealed their weakness against a weight no traditional structure in the valley had been designed to endure. Jonas Wickler's cabin fell first. On the evening of the third day, while cradling his youngest daughter, he heard a dry snap like a gunshot. The central beam broke. The roof sagged, bursting the upper boards. Jonas barely managed to shove his wife and children out the back door before the entire roof collapsed, burying everything under hardened snow. He stood in the storm, trembling, watching the home he had lived in for 18 years vanish in seconds. At Reverend Fulton's cabin, wind didn't blow downward but sideways, pressing force across the entire north wall. By the second night, snow banked level with the roof, forming a white wall weighing tons. 2 sturdy fir support posts, solid in every previous winter, snapped like dry twigs. The Fulton family had to drag each other to the Harrow home in darkness, abandoning a house tilting and collapsing fast. The Harrow cabin fared no better. By the 4th day, its roof sagged nearly 40 centimeters. The fireplace couldn't keep the interior above 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and wind howled through every wood crack like a wounded animal. In just the first 2 nights, 4 people in the valley perished, some while trying to shovel snow from roofs, some inside their own cabins as ceilings iced over and wind blew all night. But while the entire valley struggled, Widow Eleanor Cade's cabin stood as a defiant exception to every rule. Her outer roof continuously shed snow to both sides thanks to the 42 degrees pitch, creating small avalanches rumbling off like miniature waterfalls. Snow never accumulated enough to impose dangerous load, so the inner roof bore no weight at all. Each time wind struck, it hit only the outer layer, then escaped through vents, losing energy before reaching the second roof. Beneath that double protection, Eleanor's cabin held steady at 51-54 degrees Fahrenheit, and most astonishingly, she used so little firewood that many couldn't believe it. Exactly 2 small armloads per day. By the 4th night, the first broke. Jonas, the man who had laughed loudest under her roof all autumn, now waded chest-deep through snow, clutching his purple-lipped daughter tight to his chest. Wind struck his face like stone slaps, each step threatening to drop him forever. He pounded on Eleanor's door, voice barely audible. "If you don't open, we'll die here." The door opened. A rush of warm air spilled out, forming a small cloud in the cold wind. Eleanor stood there, holding the oil lamp, asking nothing and mentioning no past. "Come in quick. It's warm inside." Those 4 words saved Jonas's entire family. But they weren't the last. Within hours, the Harrows arrived, then the Fultons, then group after group fleeing collapsing cabins, following fence lines and clinging to the emergency ropes Miles Harrow had strung between homes. Later arrivals helped earlier ones. Children were wrapped in thick blankets. The elderly pulled on makeshift sleds. By dawn of the 6th day, Eleanor's 6x 8-meter cabin held over 20 people, an impossible-seeming number. Yet the widow's second roof kept it above 48 degrees Fahrenheit despite 20 people's breath thickening the air. When a snow column slammed the outer roof, the inner one only quivered like a breath. No one suffered frostbite. No one else died. Throughout the 11 days buried in snow, not one person sheltered in Eleanor's cabin was injured or chilled. For the first time in months, the whole Northwood Ridge Valley had to face a truth they had mocked. The second roof they called insane was the only thing standing between them and winter's white death. And in the survivors' silence, Only one thing was clear. When the blizzard wanted to take everything, it left one place that knew how to breathe. That cabin, her cabin. When the storm cleared on the 12th day, Northwood Ridge emerged from snow deep enough to reach an adult's chest. Survivors called the moment the return of light, but the light revealed far more than they expected: crushed cabin roofs, splintered beams like broken kindling, and a painful lesson the community had avoided for years. The first question everyone asked upon leaving Eleanor's cabin was, why did most valley cabins collapse? People began inspecting each home, recording damage, and gradually the brutal truth emerged. Single-roof cabins the standard Northwood Ridge had used for decades had borne the full load of 10-11 feet of snow dumped in one storm. At that depth, roof load reached over 55 pounds per square foot by the fourth night, climbing near 70 pounds per square foot by the sixth as wet snow compacted lower layers. All single-roof cabins took direct load, meaning no relief layer, no force transfer, no buffer to distribute pressure. One weak beam, one old joint, or one slight sag, and the entire roof slid into failure without rescue. The second reason for collapse lay in the wind's nature. During the Bitterwind Blizzard, wind didn't just descend, it struck sideways, loading cabin faces never designed for such force. At 100 miles per hour sideways, pressure on a pine wall could exceed 1,300 pounds. This caused many cabins, like Reverend Fulton's, to snap at main support posts rather than collapse from the roof. The third cause was heat loss. Single-roof cabins lost heat straight through ceilings, forcing families to burn 4-6 armloads daily just to maintain minimal warmth for the sick, children, and elderly. Faster heat loss meant thicker ceiling ice, and snow more easily hardened into stone-like slabs, the very thing that sagged the Harrow roof nearly 40 centimeters in 3 days. Those collapsed cabins were the result of a building system suited only to mild winters, unable to withstand extreme ones. And amid the wreckage, one cabin stood firm, as if from a different physics: Widow Eleanor Cade's. People began asking the second question: why did Eleanor's cabin not only survive but stand almost defiant against the blizzard? As they cleared snow layers around it to inspect, answers appeared in sharp detail. First was the outer roof. All blizzard snow load went onto the 42 degrees pitched outer layer. With steep slope and smooth surface, snow couldn't linger long. Every time it reached 6-8 inches thick, gravity and wind slid it off both sides, forming waist-high drifts around the cabin. That meant the inner roof bore not a single pound of load. Second was the 14-inch air gap, the still air between roofs. When wind hit the outer roof, it was forced through vents, but as it crossed the still air layer, it lost nearly 90% of its kinetic energy before reaching the inner roof. This kept the cabin from shaking and maintained stable temperatures, preventing cold air intrusion. Some pressed hands to Eleanor's ceiling and went silent. It stayed warm, even when outside winds could knock a grown man down. Third was the inner roof's stability. Not only unshifted and undeformed, its beams remained dry, with no chilling or shrinkage. This amazed everyone because ordinary regional cabins usually pulled beams in blizzards, sagging roofs over time. But the decisive factor in Eleanor's design was the still air. Samuel Cade's notes had written, "It isn't wood that keeps people alive, but air kept the right way." And so it was the static 14-inch air acted like a natural blanket, preserving heat almost unchanged. Fourth was the outer roof's 42 degrees pitch matching ancient Alpine standards. When snow reached dangerous levels, it immediately slid off, never hardening into ice slabs that broke beams, as in Jonas's or Reverend Fulton's single-roof cabins. The regular thuds of snow falling from Eleanor's roof through the night were actually the sound of survival. Finally, the 41 support posts. When village builders checked each, they found every post bore only 40-50 pounds on average, despite outer roof snow, sometimes exceeding 60 pounds per square foot. Even load distribution prevented any single weak point from triggering chain collapse common in single-roof cabins. Once the community understood these points, they could no longer avoid the truth. The first post-storm meeting took place inside Eleanor's cabin, where over 20 had survived the darkest 11 days. Jonas Wickler, who had laughed the loudest, stood first. He removed his hat, placed it over his heart, and spoke in the voice of a man who had lost part of his life. "All my life, I've built cabins, But a widow alone, with only her husband's old notebook, understood winter better than I did. After him, Reverend Fulton rose, his face marked by sleepless nights and killing cold. "We laughed when we didn't understand," he said, each word heavy. "And the price of our mockery was human lives." No one objected. The numbers spoke for them. 11 cabins completely collapsed, 6 heavily damaged. Only one suffered, not a single board lost Eleanor's. And the strangest fact, 100% survival rate for everyone sheltered there. No frostbite, no injuries. This truth forced Northwood Ridge to make an unprecedented decision: rebuild the entire valley using Widow Cade's model. In the 3 weeks after the storm, hammers and axes rang across the valley. 17 new cabins rose following the Cade roof model, the name villagers gave to honor the once mocked widow's work. Eleanor took no payment, demanded no thanks. Each day, she moved from cabin to cabin, checking pitches, pointing out misplaced posts, adjusting the 14-inch measuring cord before families secured frames. She taught everyone how to read Samuel's notebook symbols, how to understand wind movement, and how to listen for roof vibrations to know if wind entered the vents correctly. By late March, in front of her cabin, a sign was erected by the very hands that once mocked: Eleanor Cade, the widow who outsmarted winter. The wind blowing across the sign was no longer mocking. It was the wind of recognition that sometimes knowledge lies not in degrees or prestige, but in old pages a widow kept for years because of a promise to her own life. And that winter, the whole valley learned they survived thanks to someone they once called crazy, and thanks to a roof that knew how to breathe. In 1979, more than 8 decades after the Bitterwind Blizzard etched Northwood Ridge into history, a University of Wyoming research team unexpectedly discovered in the Sheridan Valley History Museum archives an old notebook bound in cowhide, pages yellowed at the edges, with small German lettering on the cover: Das atmende Dach, the breathing roof. It was Samuel Cade's notebook, husband of the widow Eleanor, the woman the entire valley had once mocked for daring to build a second roof over her cabin. Led by structural physics professor Dr. Harold Cummings, the team decided to reconstruct Eleanor's cabin model to exact dimensions, exact pitch, exact 14-inch gap, exact 41-post layout, exact materials, exact air gap structure, and exact vent placements. No detail changed, because they wanted to see if this design truly outperformed as recorded in the 1897 county report. They named the experiment the Cade Reconstruction Project. Their first test day fell during a deep Wyoming cold snap, with temperatures nearing -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Though only ordinary cold compared to historic storms, the team was stunned by the double roof cabin's numbers. After 48 hours of continuous observation, they announced 3 results the construction world could not ignore. First, the Cade double roof's heat retention efficiency was 2.4 times higher than traditional single roofs. This meant very little firewood kept the cabin at stable temperatures. In the test, the double roof cabin stayed 1822 degrees Fahrenheit warmer inside than an identical material single roof cabin built next to it. Second, they tested simulated snow loads on both roof types. As load increased to the equivalent of 8-10 feet of snow, the single roof began sagging early, while the double roof withstood 3.1 times more load before showing beam strain. This confirmed the decades-old Northwood Ridge rumor. Eleanor's inner roof never bore a single pound of snow during the entire 1897 storm. Third, infrared sensors measured roof heat loss. The single roof cabin showed bright red bands on scans, very high heat escape. The double roof cabin was different. Thermal images stayed nearly uniform, the inner roof always in the green stable zone, which Dr. Cummings described as an insulation performance that 19th century people could not achieve without deep understanding of still air properties. After internal publication of the data, the lab sent a sample cabin to the Montana Weather Institute for comparison testing of the 14-inch air gap against modern insulation materials. The results stunned them. The still air gap in the Cade model achieved 78% of modern fiberglass efficiency without any synthetic materials. The report stated, the 14-inch air gap in the Cade model replicates the performance of 3-inch fiberglass thanks to outer layer wind cancellation and inner layer thermal stability. The 78% figure became a focal point in cold climate architecture research because it showed late 19th century mountain dwellers had unwittingly approached ideas modern engineering took nearly a century to scientifically confirm. From there, Widow Cade's cabin became a seminar topic in the University of Wyoming's Architecture and Engineering Department, and a prime example of how folk knowledge can outstrip academic knowledge. Many engineers began linking Eleanor's double roof model to passive house principles, the ultra-energy efficient housing standard considered gold from the 1990 seconds onward. Architectural engineer Emily Bradshaw stated at a 1981 seminar, "Comparing the Cade cabin to passive house designs, I see clear parallels. Dual protective layers, wind barrier layer, thermal regulation layer, still air, and self-canceling temperature differentials." Widow Cade built a passive house from rough lumber in 1896. Many construction historians also analyzed that if the double roof model had been widely adopted in late 19th century western mountain towns, history might have differed. Reviewing winter damage records in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Colorado from 1880 to 1920, researchers noted most winter deaths stemmed from roof collapses or hypothermia due to ceiling heat loss. A double roof model like Eleanor's could reduce heat loss by 60–75%. Sharply lowering death rates when cabins failed to hold warmth overnight. When the Montana Weather Institute ran historical data simulations, their conclusions silenced everyone. If the Cade-style double roof system had been adopted from 1890, hundreds of cold-related deaths in western settlements could have been prevented. This isn't just architectural improvement, it's a survival solution. When the report was publicly released in 1982, many traveled to Northwood Ridge to see the origin site, but the original cabin had been dismantled in 1934 after a small forest fire. Only the cabin's foundation stone and the sign rebuilt by valley residents remained. Eleanor Cade, the widow who outsmarted winter. Construction historians argue the double roof design's sophistication lay not in being high-tech, but in Cade's understanding of winter's essence. She didn't fight the wind. She made it lose force. She didn't resist snow. She let it slide off. She didn't block cold. She used air to create a natural warm coat. And that was something modern science took nearly a century to calculate and simulate. The Cade project became a classic case study in thermal envelope design courses, where engineering students are reminded, never underestimate knowledge distilled through living. By the late 1980 seconds, the double roof model appeared in over 14 technical theses at northern universities, and many Wyoming engineers began testing double roofs on livestock barns to save winter fuel. Each time results were published, people remembered Widow Cade, the woman without engineering degrees, without power, armed only with an old notebook and memories of her lost husband. Her story became a symbol of a principle modern scientists respect. What is mocked isn't always wrong. Sometimes it saves an entire community. The Wyoming Long-Term Climate Research Division even offered a final comment in their 1984 summary report. What Widow Cade did in 1896 was no accident. It was the fusion of experience, observation, and intuition compressed into structure, capable of surpassing the science of its era. And from that point, Eleanor Cade's breathing roof story moved from mountain regional history into modern building science history, as a reminder that sometimes an ordinary person's intelligence can precede an entire century. If you enjoy stories of ingenuity surviving harsh winters, please remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.